On November 24, 1857, in a plantation house near the Combahee River in South Carolina, 8 members of the Rutledge family sat down for their annual Thanksgiving feast. By dawn, all 8 were dead. The official county records list the cause as acute gastric fever, a common enough diagnosis in that era. But buried in the private correspondence of Dr. Silas Beaumont, the physician who attended the dying, is a single line that local historians worked for decades to suppress. The symptoms bear no resemblance to any fever I have witnessed in 30 years of practice. What made authorities so determined to hide the truth about that November night? What really happened in the dining room of Sweetwater Hall? And why did it take nearly 40 years for anyone to speak the name of the woman who prepared that final meal? Before we continue with the story of Sweetwater Hall and the Rutledge family, I want to ask you something. This channel brings you the darkest, most disturbing stories from American history, tales that have been buried, forgotten, or deliberately hidden. If you appreciate the research and storytelling that goes into uncovering these mysteries, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. And I am curious, where are you listening from right now? Drop your state or city in the comments below. It helps me understand where our community of dark history enthusiasts is located. Now, let us return to that November evening in 1857 and discover what led to one of the most meticulously planned acts of revenge in the antebellum South. The events of that night did not begin at the dinner table. They began decades earlier, in circumstances that would shape everything that followed. Sweetwater Hall stood 3 miles inland from the Combahee River, a modest plantation by low-country standards, with just under 200 acres of rice fields and approximately 40 enslaved workers. The main house, built in 1798, had been in the Rutledge family for 2 generations. By 1857, it was showing its age. The white columns needed fresh paint, the third-floor shutters hung crooked, and the kitchen building, separated from the main house by a covered walkway, had a persistent leak that no one bothered to fix. Colonel Marcus Rutledge, 63 years old that November, had inherited the property from his father in 1832. He was not a wealthy man by plantation standards. The rice crop had been mediocre for 3 consecutive years, and he had been forced to sell off parcels of land to settle debts. His wife, Constance, 58, came from Charleston society and had never quite forgiven him for bringing her to what she called the Mosquito Kingdom. Their 4 adult children had all remained nearby, unable or unwilling to establish themselves elsewhere. The eldest son, Marcus Jr., 36, had failed at law school and returned home to manage the plantation with notable incompetence. His wife, Rebecca, 32, spent most of her time writing letters to relatives in Charleston, complaining about the isolation. The second son, Thomas, 33, had a gambling problem that kept him perpetually in debt to his father. The daughter, Elizabeth, 29, had been engaged twice but never married, and had developed a reputation for a sharp tongue and a sharper temper. The youngest son, William, 26, had studied medicine for 1 year before returning home, claiming the sight of blood made him ill. They were not a happy family. They were not even a particularly functional family. What held them together was not love, but habit, obligation, and the simple fact that none of them had anywhere else to go. In the kitchen building, separated from this dysfunction by a distance of 40 feet and a gulf of circumstance far wider, worked a woman named Patience. She was 38 years old in 1857, though she looked older. Plantation records listed her as house property, valued at $700 in the estate inventory of 1849. She had been born at Sweetwater Hall. Her mother, whose name appears in the records only as Old Bess, had worked in the same kitchen until her death in 1846. Patience had learned to cook at her mother's side, starting when she was 6 years old. By 1857, Patience had been preparing the Rutledge family's meals for over 30 years. She knew precisely how Colonel Rutledge liked his coffee, how Rebecca would send back any dish with too much pepper, how Thomas would eat anything if he was drunk enough, which was most evenings. She knew the family's routines, their preferences, their secrets, and their weaknesses better than they knew them themselves. What she also knew, what she had carried with her every single day for 11 years, was that on March 7th, 1846, Marcus Jr. had sold her 10-year-old daughter, Grace, to a cotton broker from Alabama, who was passing through the area looking for young house servants. He had done this while his father was in Charleston on business, and he had done it without telling Patience beforehand. She had been preparing dinner when Grace was taken. She had heard her daughter screaming from the front of the house. By the time she reached the yard, the wagon was already moving down the oak-lined drive. Grace's face, pressed against the wooden slats, was the last Patience ever saw of her child. Marcus Jr. had pocketed the $200 and used it to pay a gambling debt. When Patience confronted him, weeping, begging to know where her daughter had been taken, he had backhanded her across the face and told her that nigger children were property, not people, and she had better remember that. Colonel Rutledge, when he returned and discovered what his son had done, had been furious, not because a child had been torn from her mother, but because Marcus Jr. had acted without permission and had undervalued the girl. "You could have gotten 250 at least," he had said. He made no effort to locate Grace or retrieve her. For 11 years, Patience cooked their meals. For 11 years, she smiled when expected to smile, lowered her eyes when expected to lower her eyes, and responded with, "Yes, sir," and "Yes, ma'am," to every order and insult. For 11 years she waited, and for 11 years she learned. She learned which plants growing wild in the woods behind the plantation could cause vomiting and which could cause something far worse. She learned this from old Isaiah, who worked in the stables and who had been a root doctor before he was enslaved. Isaiah was careful about what he taught, but Patience was patient. She learned slowly, asked questions carefully, and never revealed her true purpose. She learned about oleander, which grew in decorative bushes all around the main house, beautiful and deadly. She learned about pokeweed berries, which could be mistaken for elderberries if you were not careful. She learned about water hemlock root, which could be ground into a powder and which, in sufficient quantity, would cause convulsions, paralysis, and death within hours. She also learned about dosage, about timing, about symptoms. Isaiah, though he never asked directly what she intended to do with this knowledge, seemed to understand. Before he died in 1855, he told her one final thing. If you aim to make them suffer, you give them a little at a time. If you aim to make a point, you give them everything at once. Patience aimed to make a point. The decision to act on Thanksgiving Day was not random. Patience had been planning the specifics for over 2 years, ever since Marcus Jr. had mentioned casually, over breakfast one morning in 1855, that he was grateful he had never wasted money buying back that little wench, because she had probably died of fever by then anyway. He had laughed when he said it. Rebecca had laughed too. Thanksgiving at Sweetwater Hall was always a formal affair, despite the family's declining fortunes. Constance Rutledge insisted on maintaining certain standards. The dining room would be decorated with pine branches and dried flowers. The good china would be brought out from storage, the silver polished until it gleamed. All family members were required to attend, dressed properly, and to sit through the entire meal without complaint. November 24th, 1857, was unseasonably warm. The morning had been foggy, but by mid-afternoon the sun had burned through, leaving the air thick and humid. In the kitchen building, Patience had been working since before dawn. She had prepared the traditional dishes: roasted turkey, ham glazed with brown sugar and cloves, sweet potato casserole, rice with gravy, cornbread dressing, collard greens, cranberry sauce, 3 different types of pie. The kitchen was sweltering, the wood stove radiating heat, and Patience's dress was soaked through with sweat by noon. But she worked with unusual care that day. Every dish was prepared to perfection. The turkey skin was golden and crisp. The ham glistened. The pies had been baked for precisely the right amount of time, their crusts flaky and golden brown. and into 8 of the 9 place settings she had incorporated her years of carefully gathered knowledge. The method was simple, almost elegant in its simplicity. Water hemlock root, dried and ground into a fine powder, had been mixed into the brown sugar glaze that coated the ham. The dosage was precise, enough to be lethal to an adult, but slow-acting enough that symptoms would not appear immediately. She wanted them to finish the meal. She wanted them to sit together, satisfied and full, before the first cramps began. The 9th place setting at the far end of the table was different. That was where Samuel, the house servant who usually assisted with serving, would sit after the family had been served. His food came from separate pots, prepared with the same care but without the addition she had made to theirs. At 4 o'clock, as the November sun began its descent, the Rutledge family assembled in the dining room. Colonel Rutledge sat at the head of the table, Constance at the foot. The children and their spouses filled the sides. The conversation was strained, as it usually was. Thomas was already drunk. Elizabeth made several cutting remarks about Rebecca's dress. Marcus Jr. complained about the cotton prices, as if he had any involvement in cotton production. Patience and Samuel brought out the dishes course by course. The family ate with enthusiasm. Colonel Rutledge praised the turkey. Constance remarked that the ham was particularly good this year, the glaze perfectly balanced. Marcus Jr. had 3 helpings. Thomas ate steadily, methodically, barely pausing between bites. Rebecca picked at her food, as always, but even she finished most of her ham. By 5:30 the meal was complete. The family retired to the parlor for coffee and brandy, as was their tradition. Patience and Samuel cleared the table. In the kitchen, Samuel ate his portion of the food, while Patience washed the first load of dishes. At approximately 6:15, Elizabeth Rutledge began to vomit. Within 10 minutes, all 8 members of the family were experiencing severe gastrointestinal distress. Dr. Beaumont, who lived 2 miles away, was summoned immediately. He arrived at 7 o'clock to find the Rutledge family in various states of collapse. The symptoms were identical across all 8 patients: violent vomiting, intense abdominal cramping, profuse sweating, and rapidly developing muscle weakness. By 8 o'clock, the first convulsions began. Thomas Rutledge, the strongest of the group, was first. His body arched backward with such force that Dr. Beaumont later testified he heard vertebrae crack. The convulsions spread to the others in quick succession. Colonel Rutledge, Marcus Jr., Rebecca, William, Elizabeth, and finally Constance all began to seize. The sounds coming from the upper floor of Sweetwater Hall that evening were described by neighboring plantation owners as ungodly and like the screams of animals in traps. Dr. Beaumont administered every treatment he knew: induced vomiting, which the patients were already experiencing; charcoal preparations, which they could not keep down; laudanum, which had no effect on the convulsions. Nothing worked. The patients continued to deteriorate, their bodies racked with spasms, their breathing becoming increasingly labored. William Rutledge died first, at 9:45. His heart simply stopped between convulsions. Thomas followed at 10:30. Elizabeth lasted until midnight. Rebecca, despite her small size and usual fragility, fought until 1 in the morning. Marcus Jr., the man who had sold a 10-year-old girl for $200, died at 1:45, his face frozen in a rictus of agony. Colonel Rutledge and Constance, perhaps because they had eaten less of the ham, lasted the longest. They died within minutes of each other, just before dawn. The colonel's last words, witnessed by Dr. Beaumont and recorded in his notes, were, "Who did this to us?" In the kitchen building, Patience had waited through the night. She had heard the screams. She had watched Dr. Beaumont's carriage arrive, had seen neighbors gather, had observed the chaos unfolding in the main house. She had remained in the kitchen, continuing to wash dishes, to clean, to maintain the routine she had followed for 30 years. When Samuel came to tell her, near dawn, that all 8 were dead, she looked at him with an expression he would later describe as terrifyingly calm, and said only, I expect they will be needing breakfast prepared for the guests who will be arriving today. The immediate aftermath of the deaths threw the entire Low Country into turmoil. 8 members of a plantation family, dead within hours of each other, was unprecedented. The initial assumption was cholera or some other epidemic disease. Dr. Beaumont, despite his private suspicions, wrote acute gastric fever on the death certificates. To write anything else would have required him to explain what he suspected but could not prove. Within 24 hours, neighbors began arriving to help. The bodies needed to be prepared for burial, the house needed to be managed, and decisions needed to be made about the plantation's future. The Rutledge family had extended relatives in Charleston, but none arrived for nearly 3 days, the time it took for news to reach them. During those 3 days, Patience continued her work. She prepared meals for the visitors, cleaned the house, and went about her duties with the same quiet efficiency she had always shown. Several of the neighbor women later remarked on her composure. She did not shed a single tear. One wrote in her diary, "I thought perhaps the shock had frozen her grief." The funeral took place on November 28th, 4 days after the deaths. All 8 family members were buried in the small cemetery on the plantation grounds, their graves marked with simple stones. Reverend Thomas Mackenzie, who presided over the service, gave a sermon about God's mysterious ways and the importance of accepting divine will. Nearly 200 people attended. Patience stood at the back of the crowd, her face expressionless. The investigation, such as it was, began almost immediately after the funeral. Dr. Beaumont, troubled by what he had witnessed, spoke privately with the county sheriff, Benjamin Hartwell. Sheriff Hartwell, a practical man with little patience for medical mysteries, was inclined to accept the fever diagnosis and close the matter. But Beaumont was insistent. "I have treated hundreds of fever cases," he told the sheriff. This was not fever. The symptoms were consistent with poisoning, specifically with some form of plant toxin. The convulsions, the rapidity of onset, the fact that all 8 were affected identically, all of this points to deliberate introduction of poison into food or drink. Sheriff Hartwell understood the implications immediately. If the Rutledge family had been poisoned, the most likely suspect was obvious. Patience had prepared the meal. She was enslaved. And under South Carolina law at that time, an enslaved person who murdered a white person was subject to execution, usually by hanging, sometimes by burning. But there were complications. First, there was no physical evidence. The food had been mostly consumed or thrown away. The few samples that remained showed nothing unusual under visual inspection, and there were no chemical tests available in that time and place that could detect plant toxins. Second, there were no witnesses to any suspicious activity. Samuel, who had worked alongside Patience that day, testified that she had prepared the meal exactly as she always did, using ingredients from the plantation's own stores. Third, and perhaps most importantly, there was the matter of motive and opportunity. If Patience had wanted to poison the family, she could have done so at any time over the past 30 years. Why now? Why on Thanksgiving? And why would she have remained at the plantation afterward rather than fleeing? Sheriff Hartwell questioned Patience on December 1st in the dining room of Sweetwater Hall with Dr. Beaumont and 2 other witnesses present. The interview was recorded in the sheriff's official notes, and those notes survive in the Colleton County archives. "Did you prepare the Thanksgiving meal served on November 24th? Hartwell asked. "Yes, sir," Patience replied. "Did you prepare it the same way you always prepare such meals?" "Yes, sir." "Did you add anything unusual to the food?" "No, sir." "Did you have any reason to wish harm to the Rutledge family?" Patience hesitated for a long moment before answering. The witnesses later disagreed on how to interpret that hesitation. Some thought she was carefully considering her response. Others thought she was experiencing genuine grief or confusion. "No, sir," she finally said. "You are aware that all 8 members of the family died after eating the meal you prepared?" "Yes, sir." "And you have no explanation for this?" "I expect it was the fever, sir, as the doctor said." Hartwell pressed her for another hour, but her answers never varied. She had prepared the meal as she always did. She had used ingredients from the plantation stores. She had no explanation for the deaths. She showed no emotion throughout the questioning, which Hartwell noted in his report as suspicious in itself. But without evidence, without witnesses, and without a confession, there was nothing he could charge her with. The law required proof, even when the accused was enslaved. Suspicion was not enough. The Charleston relatives who eventually arrived to settle the estate faced a difficult decision. Patience was valuable property, worth at least $600, but she was also potentially dangerous. If she had poisoned the Rutledge family, what was to stop her from poisoning whoever purchased her next? The compromise solution was to sell her quickly and quietly, without mentioning the circumstances of the Rutledge deaths. In January of 1858, she was sold to a merchant named Edward Fletcher, who operated a dry goods store in Charleston and needed household help. The sale price was $400, a significant discount that raised no questions because it was explained as a quick estate settlement. Patience left Sweetwater Hall on January 15, 1858. She had lived there for 38 years. She never returned, and she never saw Grace again. Edward Fletcher's household in Charleston was small. Fletcher himself, his wife Margaret, and their 2 young daughters, ages 8 and 6. They lived above the store on Meeting Street, in a modest apartment that was nevertheless far more comfortable than the quarters Patience had occupied at Sweetwater Hall. Fletcher was a nervous man, thin and pale, with a persistent cough that his wife attributed to the dampness of Charleston's climate. He had bought Patience despite his wife's objections because he needed help in the store and could not afford to hire free labor. Margaret Fletcher made her unhappiness with the arrangement clear from the start. "I know what happened at that plantation," Margaret told her husband within Patience's hearing on the first day. "Everyone knows. And you brought her into our home, where our children sleep." The sheriff found no evidence. Fletcher replied weakly. "It was fever. The doctor said so." But Margaret's fears were not irrational, because by 1858, rumors about the Thanksgiving deaths had spread throughout the Charleston social circles. The story had evolved with each retelling. Some versions claimed that Patience had confessed before fleeing. Others insisted that physical evidence had been found but suppressed. A few even suggested that Patience had practiced African witchcraft and cursed the food, though these versions were considered less credible than the poisoning theory. The truth was that no one knew for certain what had happened at Sweetwater Hall, but everyone had an opinion. And in a society built on the forced labor of enslaved people, the possibility that one of them had successfully murdered 8 members of a plantation family was deeply, fundamentally threatening. Patience's life in the Fletcher household was carefully monitored. Margaret insisted that Patience never be left alone with food preparation. All meals were either prepared by Margaret herself or prepared by Patience under Margaret's direct supervision. Patience was not allowed near the family's sleeping quarters unsupervised. She was given a locked room in the back of the store and was required to remain there after the store closed each evening. For 6 months, nothing unusual occurred. Patience performed her duties with the same quiet efficiency she had always shown. She was polite, deferential, and gave no cause for complaint beyond Margaret's persistent anxiety. Fletcher's business actually improved slightly during this period, as Patience proved to be better at managing inventory than he had been. Then, in July of 1858, Edward Fletcher became ill. The illness began with stomach cramps and nausea, similar to but less severe than what the Rutledge family had experienced. Fletcher's family physician, Dr. Raymond Cortland, diagnosed it as acute dyspepsia and prescribed a bland diet and abstinence from alcohol. Fletcher improved within a few days. 2 weeks later, the symptoms returned, more severe this time. Fletcher was bedridden for 4 days. Dr. Cortland, growing concerned, began asking more detailed questions about Fletcher's diet and daily routine. When he learned that Patience had been purchased from the Rutledge estate, his concern deepened into alarm. That woman needs to be removed from your household immediately, Colleton told Fletcher and Margaret in early August. I do not care what the sheriff said or what the official cause of death was. The timing and nature of your illness is too similar to be coincidental. Fletcher, however, was in a difficult position. He had paid $400 for patience. He could not simply dismiss her without selling her first, and selling her would mean either taking a significant financial loss or lying to the buyer about her background. He needed time to find a solution. The solution, when it came, was not what anyone expected. On August 17, 1858, a woman appeared at Fletcher's store asking to speak with Patience. She was well-dressed, clearly from Charleston's merchant class, and she introduced herself as Mrs. Catherine Lowell, wife of a shipping agent. She had a peculiar request. I understand you have in your household a woman named Patience, formerly of Sweetwater Hall Plantation, Mrs. Lowell said to Fletcher. I wish to purchase her from you. Fletcher was immediately suspicious. May I ask why? He said. Mrs. Lowell's expression was difficult to read. I have information regarding her daughter, she said. Information she has been seeking for many years. I am willing to pay you $600 for her, which I believe is above what you paid. This was an extraordinary offer. Fletcher had expected to lose money on Patience's resale, not profit from it. But he was also deeply wary. If Mrs. Lowell knew about Grace, she almost certainly knew about the Thanksgiving deaths. Why would she pay a premium for someone suspected of mass murder? I will need to consult with my wife, Fletcher said. Of course, Mrs. Lowell replied. I will return tomorrow at the same time. But please understand, Mr. Fletcher, this offer will not remain open indefinitely. I am prepared to complete the transaction immediately if you agree. That evening, the Fletchers debated the offer. Margaret wanted to accept immediately, both for the profit and to remove Patience from their home. Edward was torn between financial sense and a growing curiosity about Mrs. Lowell's true motives. In the end, greed and fear combined to produce a decision. The next day, when Mrs. Lowell returned, Fletcher agreed to the sale. The paperwork was completed within an hour. Patience, who had not been consulted about any of this, was informed that she had been sold again and would be leaving with Mrs. Lowell immediately. As they walked away from Fletcher's store, Mrs. Lowell spoke for the first time directly to Patience. I imagine you have questions, she said. Patience, after 11 years of containing every emotion, every thought, every flicker of hope or rage, allowed herself one question. Do you know where Grace is? Mrs. Lowell stopped walking and turned to face her. I do, she said, and I will tell you. But first, there is something you need to understand about who I am and why I have done this. Catherine Lowell was not who she claimed to be. Her real name was Catherine Brennan, and she was not the wife of a shipping agent. She was a widow whose husband, a Methodist minister named Thomas Brennan, had died of yellow fever in 1856. Since his death, she had dedicated herself to a cause that was both dangerous and illegal in South Carolina. She was an abolitionist. Not merely an abolitionist in sympathy, which many Charleston residents were privately, but an active participant in the network of people who helped enslaved individuals escape to freedom in the North. She was, in modern terms, a conductor on the Underground Railroad, though that term was not widely used at the time in South Carolina. Mrs. Lowell's work was funded by Northern abolition societies and carried out with extreme caution. South Carolina had some of the harshest laws in the nation regarding abolition activities. Anyone caught assisting enslaved people in escaping could be imprisoned, fined enormous sums, or even executed depending on the circumstances. The social consequences were equally severe. Exposure would mean complete ostracism from Charleston society. She had learned about Patience's story through the abolitionist network. News of the Thanksgiving deaths had traveled through back channels, whispered in the quarters of enslaved people across the Lowcountry, passed along to those who might use such information. To many enslaved people, Patience had become a figure of dark legend. The woman who had supposedly killed 8 white people and walked away free. Whether the story was true or not, Mrs. Lowell saw opportunity. If Patience had indeed done what people said, she was someone of exceptional courage and capability. And more importantly, she was someone who had every reason to hate the system that had enslaved her and stolen her child. "I need you to understand something," Mrs. Lowell told Patience as they walked through Charleston streets toward a boarding house on the city's outskirts. "Everything I am about to tell you could get both of us killed if the wrong people learn of it. But I believe you can be trusted. I believe you have already demonstrated that you can keep secrets." Over the next 3 hours, in a locked room at the boarding house, Mrs. Lowell explained the network she was part of, the routes used to move people north, the safe houses, the contacts, the methods of communication. She explained that she had been doing this work for 2 years and had successfully helped 19 people reach freedom in Pennsylvania and New York. And then she explained why she had sought out Patience, specifically. "I need someone who can work in a plantation household," Mrs. Lowell said. "Someone who will not draw suspicion. Someone who can identify which enslaved people are ready to escape and can be trusted. Someone who can communicate information to me about plantation routines, security, the movement of overseers and masters. You have skills that are valuable to this work. But more than that, I believe you have motivation." Patience listened without speaking. When Mrs. Lowell finished, she asked the question that had been burning in her mind since they left Fletcher's store. "Where is Grace?" Mrs. Lowell's expression softened slightly. "She is in Montgomery, Alabama. She was sold twice after leaving South Carolina. The first sale was to a cotton plantation outside Mobile, where she worked for 4 years. The second sale was to a merchant family in Montgomery, where she currently works as a house servant. She is alive. According to our contacts, she is in reasonably good health. Can you get her out?" "Potentially, but the logistics are extremely difficult. Alabama is much further from the north than South Carolina. The routes are longer, the risks greater. It would require significant resources and careful planning." Patience absorbed this information silently. Then she asked, "What do you want from me?" "I want you to go back into plantation work," Mrs. Lowell said. "I can place you in a household where you will have access to information we need. In exchange, I will work toward bringing Grace to freedom. I cannot promise it will happen quickly. I cannot promise it will happen at all. But I can promise that I will try, and that I have resources you do not. And if I refuse, then I will help you reach the north yourself if you wish. You have already paid a terrible price for your freedom, though you are not legally free. You deserve to live without fear, but I am asking you to do something more. I am asking you to use what you have learned, what you have suffered, to help others." Patience considered this for a long moment. Outside the boarding house window, Charleston continued its daily business, oblivious to the conversation taking place in the locked room. Finally, she spoke. "I need to know one thing," she said. "The people you help escape, what happens to them? Do they truly reach freedom?" Mrs. Lowell met her eyes directly. "Most of them do. Some are recaptured. The risk is real. But those who make it to Pennsylvania or New York, they are free. They can work, marry, have families, live as human beings rather than property. It is not paradise. The North has its own prejudices, its own cruelties, but it is better than this." "Then I will do what you ask," Patience said, "on one condition. When Grace reaches freedom, I want to see her. I do not care how long it takes. I do not care what I must do in the meantime. But when she is safe, I want to see my daughter again. I will do everything in my power to make that happen," Mrs. Lowell said. They shook hands. In that moment, Patience committed herself to a path that would define the remaining years of her life. She would return to the world of plantation houses and forced servitude. But this time, she would be there by choice, not by law. And this time, she would be working not just for herself, but for others who shared her suffering. Over the next 3 weeks, Mrs. Lowell arranged Patience's placement at a plantation called Riverside, located 40 miles inland from Charleston along the Santee River. The plantation was owned by a man named Jonathan Hargrove, who had recently lost his cook to pneumonia and was looking for a replacement. Mrs. Lowell, using her connections in Charleston Merchant Society, recommended Patience, carefully omitting her connection to Sweetwater Hall. Patience arrived at Riverside in mid-September of 1858. The plantation was larger than Sweetwater Hall, with over 400 acres and 60 enslaved workers. Hargrove was a shrewd businessman who prided himself on running an efficient operation. His oversight was thorough but not sadistic. He was, by the standards of the time and place, considered a relatively humane master, which meant he did not regularly beat people to death and provided adequate food and shelter. Within weeks, Patience had established herself as an excellent cook and a reliable worker. She learned the routines of the household, the habits of the overseer, the patterns of who came and went and when. She identified which of the enslaved workers might be ready to attempt escape and which could be trusted with sensitive information. And slowly, carefully, she began to pass information to Mrs. Lowell through a network of contacts. A laundress who made weekly trips to Charleston, a free black man who delivered supplies to the plantation, a white merchant who was secretly sympathetic to abolition. The information was simple but valuable. When Hargrove would be away on business, when the overseer was distracted with other matters, which routes through the swamp were passable at which times of year, where dogs were kept and how they could be avoided. Over the following months, 3 people escaped from Riverside Plantation using information Patience had provided. All 3 reached Pennsylvania safely. Mrs. Lowell sent word of their success through the network, and with that word came a message for Patience. Your daughter is being moved to a safe location in preparation for her journey north. Remain patient. But patience, the virtue for which she had been named, was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Every day in the Hargrove household reminded her of what she had lost. Every time she prepared a meal, she thought of the Thanksgiving dinner at Sweetwater Hall. Every time she saw Hargrove's young daughter, she thought of Grace at 10 years old, torn away from her mother. The rage that she had channeled into planning and executing the poisoning of 8 people had not dissipated. It had merely been redirected. And as weeks turned into months with no word of Grace's successful escape, that rage began to burn hotter. In March of 1859, 16 months after the Thanksgiving deaths, Patience received a message from Mrs. Lowell that would test her self-control more severely than anything since Grace had been taken. The message was brief. Grace's escape attempt failed. She has been recaptured and sold to a plantation outside Selma. We do not currently have contacts in that area. Efforts to establish a route are ongoing. Do not lose hope. When Patience read those words, standing in the kitchen building at Riverside on a warm March afternoon, something inside her went cold and still. She had waited 11 years for revenge on the Rutledge family. She had waited another 16 months for her daughter's freedom. And now she was being told to wait longer. That night, Jonathan Hargrove's evening meal included a dish that Patience had not prepared in over a year. Ham with brown sugar glaze. Jonathan Hargrove became violently ill approximately 2 hours after finishing dinner on March 12, 1859. The symptoms were familiar to anyone who had read Dr. Beaumont's notes from Sweetwater Hall. Severe vomiting, intense abdominal cramping, profuse sweating, muscle weakness, and eventually convulsions. But unlike the Rutledge family, Hargrove survived. There were 2 reasons for this. First, Patience had given him a smaller dose than she had used at Sweetwater Hall, either deliberately or because her hand shook when she added the powder to his food. Second, Hargrove's household included a physician's widow, Mrs. Ann Pritchard, his mother-in-law who was visiting from Charleston. Mrs. Pritchard had seen her husband treat dozens of poisoning cases during his career, and she recognized the symptoms immediately. She forced Hargrove to drink massive quantities of water mixed with ash from the fireplace, inducing vomiting beyond what the poison had already caused. She kept him conscious through willpower and repeated applications of cold water to his face and chest. And she sent for a physician immediately, not waiting to see if the symptoms would resolve on their own. Dr. Henry Stillwell arrived within an hour and continued the aggressive treatment Mrs. Pritchard had begun. Between the two of them, they likely saved Hargrove's life. By dawn, he was stable, though weak. By the following evening, it was clear he would survive. But Mrs. Pritchard had not saved his life out of mercy alone. She had also taken careful note of what had happened, and when. She knew that Hargrove had eaten dinner at 6 o'clock. She knew that symptoms began at 8 o'clock. She knew that only Hargrove had been affected, which meant the poison had been in his portion specifically, not in a shared dish. And she knew who had prepared the meal. The discovery of what Mrs. Pritchard found in the kitchen building would become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. She had waited until dawn, when Hargrove's condition had stabilized, before conducting her search. She had been methodical, checking every jar, every container, every conceivable hiding place where something dangerous might be kept. The loose floorboard beneath the preparation table had given itself away with a slight creak when she stepped on it. Beneath it, wrapped carefully in a piece of old linen, was a cloth bag, no larger than a woman's hand. Inside that bag was approximately 2 ounces of dried root material, already ground into a coarse powder. Mrs. Pritchard had been careful not to touch it directly. She had her late husband's medical books in her traveling trunk, and she spent the next hour comparing the physical characteristics of the powder to descriptions of various poisonous plants. Water hemlock root, when dried and ground, has a distinctive yellowish-brown color and a faint unpleasant odor that some compare to parsnips left too long in damp earth. The powder in the bag matched these characteristics precisely. More tellingly, her husband's notes included a case study from 1843 involving a child who had died after consuming water hemlock root. The symptoms described matched what she had witnessed in Hargrove almost exactly. When Sheriff William Talbot arrived at Riverside on March 14th to investigate, Mrs. Pritchard presented him with the evidence and a written statement detailing her findings. She also presented him with something else, a theory. This woman did not act on impulse. Mrs. Pritchard told the sheriff in Hargrove's study, with Hargrove himself, still weak but recovering, listening from a chair by the window. The poison was prepared in advance, hidden deliberately. This suggests premeditation and planning. And if she planned to poison Mr. Hargrove, who had shown her no particular cruelty, what might she have done to previous masters? Sheriff Talbot had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize where this line of reasoning led. You are suggesting she may be connected to other incidents? I am suggesting that someone should inquire whether she has any history of similar occurrences. Mrs. Pritchard replied. Hargrove, his voice still hoarse from the ordeal, added a critical piece of information. I purchased her from Edward Fletcher in Charleston. Fletcher purchased her from the Rutledge estate settlement. The Rutledge family, if you recall, died under mysterious circumstances in late 1857. The connection once made seemed obvious in retrospect. Within hours, Sheriff Talbot had sent telegrams to Colleton County requesting all available information about the Sweetwater Hall deaths. By evening, he had received a response from Sheriff Hartwell, who had investigated those deaths and had harbored suspicions about Patience that he had been unable to prove. Patience was arrested the next morning while preparing breakfast. She had shown no sign of intending to flee. She had continued her work as though nothing had happened, as though Hargrove's near death was merely an unfortunate coincidence. When Sheriff Talbot confronted her in the kitchen, asking directly if she had poisoned Hargrove's food, she had looked at him with an expression he would later describe as utterly without remorse or fear, and said simply, I have nothing to say to you. She was taken to the county jail in Charleston that same day. The journey took 6 hours by wagon, and during the entire trip, Patience spoke only once. As they passed through a small town along the route, she asked the deputy escorting her what month it was. When he told her it was March, she nodded and said nothing more. The trial of Patience began on April 26, 1859, in the Charleston courthouse. The building was packed with spectators from the first day. News of the arrest had spread quickly, and the connection to the Sweetwater Hall deaths had transformed what might have been a routine case into something far more sensational. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Marcus Sullivan, an ambitious lawyer who recognized that this case could make his career. His opening statement was calculated to horrify. "Gentlemen of the jury, you will hear evidence of a woman who has used her position of trust in the households of respectable families to commit acts of murder that are almost unprecedented in their scope and cruelty. This is not a case of spontaneous violence or self-defense. This is calculated, cold-blooded poisoning, carried out with planning and deliberation." The evidence presented over the first 2 days was damning. Dr. Stillwell testified about Hargrove's symptoms and his opinion that they were consistent with plant poisoning. Mrs. Pritchard testified about finding the hidden poison and described in detail the methodical way she had searched the kitchen. Sheriff Talbot presented the physical evidence: the cloth bag, its contents, the linen wrapping. On the third day, the prosecution called Sheriff Hartwell from Colleton County. His testimony about the Sweetwater Hall investigation was particularly damaging. He described his suspicions at the time, his questioning of Patience, her calm demeanor, and his frustration at being unable to prove anything. "I knew in my gut that something was wrong," he testified. "But without evidence, without confession, without witnesses, my hands were tied." Dr. Beaumont's written notes from that night were entered into evidence and read aloud to the jury. The descriptions of the Rutledge family's suffering were graphic enough that several jury members visibly reacted. The similarities between those symptoms and what Hargrove had experienced were undeniable. The defense attorney, Robert Mansfield, was a young lawyer who had been practicing for less than 2 years. He had been appointed by the court because Patience, as enslaved property, could not hire her own counsel and had no one willing to pay for her defense. Mansfield was in an impossible position. The evidence was overwhelming. The public sentiment was against his client, and he had almost no resources to mount an effective defense. His strategy, such as it was, focused on raising doubt about the connection between the two incidents. He argued that the Sweetwater Hall deaths had been officially attributed to gastric fever, not poisoning. He pointed out that no physical evidence had been found at Sweetwater Hall connecting Patience to any wrongdoing. He suggested that the poison found at Riverside might have been planted by someone else, though he could not offer a plausible theory as to who or why. His cross-examination of Mrs. Pritchard was particularly weak. "Is it not possible," he asked, "that the powder you found could have been there for innocent purposes, perhaps for controlling rodents?" Mrs. Pritchard's response was devastating. "I am familiar with the substances commonly used for rodent control, Mr. Mansfield. They are typically arsenic-based compounds that would present quite differently from what I found. Moreover, water hemlock root is not an effective rodenticide. Its primary characteristic is that it is lethal to humans and livestock. There is no innocent explanation for its presence in that kitchen." The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning a guilty verdict on the charge of attempted murder of Jonathan Hargrove. Then came the moment that transformed the trial from a straightforward criminal case into something that would be discussed in legal circles for decades afterward. During the sentencing phase, before Judge Abraham Townsend could pronounce sentence, Mrs. Pritchard stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, before sentence is passed, I believe this court and this jury should be aware of the full scope of this woman's crimes. Based on the evidence presented and my own investigation, I am convinced that she is also responsible for the deaths of 8 members of the Rutledge family on November 24, 1857. The courtroom erupted. Judge Townsend gavelled for order repeatedly before finally threatening to clear the room. When silence was restored, he addressed Mrs. Pritchard directly. "Mrs. Pritchard, this is highly irregular. The defendant has been tried and convicted on charges relating to your son-in-law. The Sweetwater Hall matter is a separate incident that has never been prosecuted. With respect, Your Honor, I believe justice demands that we acknowledge the full pattern of this woman's behavior. If she is to be sentenced, the sentence should reflect not just one attempted murder, but multiple successful ones. Judge Townsend was silent for a long moment, considering the implications. Then he made a decision that would be controversial even by the standards of 1859 Southern justice. The court will recess for 1 week. During that time, the prosecution will prepare additional charges relating to the deaths at Sweetwater Hall. The defendant will be held pending this additional proceeding. The second phase of the trial began on May 4th, 1859. This time, the charge was murder, 8 counts. The evidence was entirely circumstantial. The prosecution could not produce the poisoned food, could not produce witnesses to the act of poisoning, could not even definitively prove that poisoning had occurred at Sweetwater Hall, since the official cause of death had been listed as fever. What they could prove was opportunity, means, and motive. Patience had prepared the meal. She had access to the means, as demonstrated by what was found at Riverside. And the motive, they argued, was the sale of her daughter Grace 11 years earlier. This was where Marcus Sullivan made his most powerful argument. He called to the stand a merchant named David Lawson, who had been present at Sweetwater Hall on the day Grace was sold. Lawson testified that he had witnessed the transaction and had seen Patience's reaction when she realized what was happening. "I have never forgotten it," Lawson said quietly. "The sound she made was not quite human. It was the sound of something breaking that could never be repaired. And the look on her face, I have seen wounded animals with more hope in their eyes." Sullivan turned to the jury. "Gentlemen, we have established motive. A mother's love twisted into a mother's hatred by an unbearable loss. We have established opportunity. She prepared every meal that family ate for 3 decades. And we have established means. She possessed the knowledge and the material to commit these murders. The only question before you is whether she actually did so." Mansfield's defense in this second phase was even weaker than in the first. He had no alternative explanation for the deaths. He could only argue that suspicion was not proof, that circumstantial evidence was not sufficient for a conviction of this magnitude. The jury in the second trial deliberated for 90 minutes before returning guilty verdicts on all 8 counts of murder. On May 8, 1859, Judge Townsend sentenced Patience to death by hanging. Under South Carolina law, the sentence would be carried out within 30 days. There would be no appeal. During the 3 weeks between sentencing and execution, Patience was held in a cell in the Charleston jail's condemned section. The cell was small, perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet, with a single barred window high on one wall that let in a narrow shaft of sunlight during the morning hours. She was given a straw mattress, 1 blanket, and access to a Bible that she could not read. She was allowed no visitors except the court-appointed chaplain, a Methodist minister named Reverend James Carlson, who came twice a week to pray with her and encourage her to confess her sins before meeting her Maker. Carlson was a young man, earnest and well-meaning, who genuinely believed he was trying to save Patience's eternal soul. Their conversations, recorded in Carlson's private journal, reveal a woman who remained defiant to the end. When he asked her if she wished to confess to the murders, she told him, "I have nothing to confess. Confession requires regret, and I have none." When he pressed her, asking if she felt no remorse for taking human lives, she replied, "Those people were not human in the eyes of the law. I was not human in the eyes of the law. Tell me, Reverend, can an animal murder? Or does murder require that both the killer and the killed be recognized as human beings?" Carlson found this response deeply troubling. He wrote in his journal, "She speaks with a clarity and intelligence that makes her crimes all the more horrifying. She is not mad. She is not confused. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she believes it was justified. How does one minister to such a soul?" On his final visit, 3 days before the execution, Carlson asked Patience if she had any final words she wished to have recorded, any message for those who would remember her. She gave him only one message, which he wrote down word for word. "Tell my daughter Grace that I never stopped looking for her. Tell her that everything I did because I loved her. Tell her that she should be free." Carlson asked her if she knew where Grace was. Patience shook her head. "I do not know if she is alive or dead. I do not know if she remembers me. But if she lives, and if she ever learns what happened to me, I want her to know that I loved her more than my own life." That message, written on a single sheet of paper in Carlson's careful handwriting, was placed in his personal papers. It would not be discovered until 1932, when his grandson donated those papers to the Charleston Historical Society. By then, if Grace had survived, she would have been 96 years old. The final days before the execution were marked by unusual activity in Charleston's abolitionist circles, though this would not become clear until years later. A woman matching Catherine Lowell's description was seen multiple times near the jail, though she never attempted to visit patients directly. Money changed hands in back rooms and quiet corners. Messages were sent north by means that deliberately left no paper trail. On the morning of June 1st, 1859, Patience was led from her cell at 9 o'clock. She had been given a simple grey dress to wear, newer and cleaner than anything she had owned in life. Her hands were bound behind her back, and a hood was prepared to place over her head once she reached the scaffold. The execution was to take place in the courtyard behind the jail, as was customary. A platform had been constructed specifically for this purpose, with 13 steps leading up to the scaffold, a symbolic number that Patience likely did not notice or care about. The noose had been tested the previous evening with weights to ensure it would function properly. A crowd of approximately 300 people had gathered. Public executions were still common entertainment in 1859, though attitudes were beginning to shift. In the crowd were plantation owners and their wives, merchants, laborers, sailors, and a handful of free black residents who had come for reasons of their own. Some were there out of morbid curiosity, others came because they believed justice was being served. A few came for reasons they could not have articulated, drawn by the spectacle of a woman being executed for refusing to accept her enslavement. As Patience was led across the courtyard, she walked steadily, without stumbling or requiring assistance. Her face was composed, though observers would later disagree about what emotion, if any, showed in her expression. Some said she looked resigned. Others said she looked peaceful. A few swore they saw something that looked like triumph. When she reached the scaffold, the executioner, a man named Thomas Greaves, who had been performing this function for the county for 7 years, guided her up the steps. At the top, he positioned her over the trapdoor and placed the noose around her neck, adjusting it carefully to ensure a quick death. This was considered humane, the minimum courtesy extended even to condemned criminals. Judge Townsend, who had attended the execution as was his custom, asked the required question, "Do you have any final words?" Patience spoke clearly enough that people in the front rows of the crowd could hear her, though those further back had to rely on second-hand accounts of what she said. "I have nothing to confess because I have done nothing wrong. Everything I did was in service of love and freedom. I regret only that I did not do more." Then she added one final sentence that many in the crowd found incomprehensible at the time, but which would be debated for years afterward. "The seeds have been planted. Others will harvest what I could not." The hood was placed over her head. Reverend Carlson recited a brief prayer. At 9:37 in the morning, Thomas Greaves released the lever, and the trapdoor opened. The official record states that death was instantaneous. Patience's body dropped approximately 5 feet, and her neck broke cleanly. The prison physician, who examined the body afterward, confirmed that she had died immediately upon the drop. This was recorded as a successful execution, carried out according to proper procedure. Her body was buried that same afternoon in the paupers section of the prison cemetery, in an unmarked grave. Under the law at that time, executed criminals were not entitled to marked graves or proper Christian burial in consecrated ground, though Reverend Carlson insisted on reading a brief service over the gravesite, despite the objections of some witnesses. The story should have ended there, with Patience dead and buried, her crimes punished, justice served according to the standards of her time and place. And indeed, for most people who witnessed or heard about the execution, that is where the story ended. But there are threads that extend beyond that June morning, threads that suggest the story is more complex than it appears. First, there is the matter of the plant material found in Patience's quarters at Riverside. The prosecution claimed it was water hemlock root, and that claim was never effectively challenged in court. But Dr. Stilwell, the physician who treated Hargrove, later wrote in his private journal that he was not entirely convinced the symptoms matched water hemlock poisoning. They were similar, but not identical. He suspected a different toxin might have been involved, possibly a combination of substances he could not identify. Second, there is the curious fact that Samuel, the house servant who worked alongside Patience at Sweetwater Hall, disappeared from the historical record entirely after the Thanksgiving deaths. He was not sold with the rest of the estate property. He was not recorded as having died. He simply vanished. Several historians have speculated that he may have successfully escaped to the north, possibly with assistance from abolition networks. Third, and most intriguingly, there are records from the Underground Railroad network that survived the Civil War. These records, scattered across various archives in Pennsylvania and New York, include references to a woman named Grace who reached Philadelphia in June of 1859, just weeks after Patience's execution. The timing is exact enough to suggest that Grace's escape may have been deliberately coordinated to occur after her mother's death, when authorities would be less likely to connect them. The woman identified as Grace in these records went by the name Grace Freeman. She settled in Philadelphia's growing free black community and worked as a seamstress. In 1864, she married a blacksmith named Thomas Warner. They had 3 children. Grace lived until 1908, dying at the age of 72. In her obituary, published in a Philadelphia newspaper, there is a single line that has fascinated historians. Mrs. Warner often spoke of her mother, who she described as a woman of remarkable strength and determination who had sacrificed everything for her daughter's freedom. Whether Grace Freeman was the same Grace who was sold away from Sweetwater Hall in 1846 is impossible to prove definitively. The circumstantial evidence is compelling, but not conclusive. What is certain is that someone made sure Grace's story did not die with Patience. Catherine Lowell continued her work with the Underground Railroad until 1863, when Union forces occupied much of South Carolina, and her services were no longer needed. She survived the Civil War and spent her final years in Boston, where she died in 1879. In her papers, donated to the Massachusetts Historical Society, there is a journal entry dated June 15, 1859. It reads, "Today I received word that the package was delivered safely to Philadelphia. The cost was higher than anticipated, but some prices are worth paying. I only wish the sender could know that her investment reached its intended destination." Sweetwater Hall itself fell into ruin during the Civil War. The plantation was burned by Union troops in 1865. The land was never rebuilt. Today, nothing remains of the main house except the foundation stones, overgrown with kudzu and forgotten by time. The cemetery where the Rutledge family was buried is still there, but the gravestones have weathered to illegibility. Local historians in Colleton County occasionally write about the Thanksgiving poisoning, but they tend to treat it as a footnote to larger stories about plantation life and the Civil War. The full details of what happened that November evening have been lost to time, obscured by lost records, faded memories, and the tendency of history to simplify complex stories into morality tales. But the questions remain. Did Patience really poison 8 people? If so, how did she acquire the knowledge and materials? Was it premeditated revenge for her daughter's sale, or was there another motive? Did she act alone, or did she have help? And what happened to the people who knew the truth but never spoke publicly? The official record says that Patience was a murderer, executed for her crimes. But the whispered stories, passed down through generations of descendants of enslaved people in the Low Country, tell a different tale. They speak of a woman who found a way to fight back against a system that had stolen everything from her. They speak of a mother's love and a mother's rage, intertwined so completely that they became indistinguishable. They speak of justice, even if the law called it murder. And they speak of a daughter named Grace, who lived to be 72 years old, raised 3 children in freedom, and told her grandchildren stories about a mother she barely remembered but never forgot. The truth about what happened in the dining room of Sweetwater Hall on Thanksgiving Day, 1857, died with Patience in the courtyard of Charleston Jail. But the reverberations of that evening continued for decades, touching lives in ways that cannot be fully traced or understood. What we know is this: 8 people died after eating a meal that Patience prepared. Another man became severely ill after eating a meal she prepared. Plant materials capable of causing those symptoms were found in her possession. She was convicted, sentenced, and executed. These are the facts. What we believe, what we suspect, what we choose to interpret from those facts, that remains open to question. History is written by those who survive and those who have the power to control the narrative. The voices of the enslaved, the voices of women like Patience who left no written record of their thoughts and motivations, those voices are largely silent. But silence is not the same as absence. The stories survive, passed down through generations, transformed and embellished, but carrying at their core a truth that transcends factual accuracy. Patience existed. Grace existed. The Rutledge family died. These things happened. Whether Patience was a murderer or a freedom fighter, a monster or a hero, depends entirely on whose story you choose to believe. And that choice, perhaps, says more about us than it does about her. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Patience was justified in her actions, or was she a murderer who deserved her fate? The line between justice and revenge is often thinner than we want to admit. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this historical mystery compelling and want more deep dives into the darkest corners of American history, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. And if you think someone you know would appreciate this tale of resistance, revenge, and the complicated nature of historical justice, share this video with them. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.